Anyway, Sim, let's dive into this Big Ten tier conversation. I don't really know how this text conversation started between the two of us, but I ended up having a lot of fun between it. And it was earlier in the week when we started it. And I think it kind of started maybe a little bit out of conference realignment discussion and just like where USC and UCLA are going to end up in the Big Ten when they join in 2024. They'll join the 2024-2025 season. So there's going to be 16 teams in the Big Ten. They need to change the name of it or call it something else because you just can't do that. But so
What when 14 teams were in it and it was the Big
yeah,
Ten, was that acceptable
well,
then?
it's been 10, I think, since it started, and then it was the Big Ten with the hidden 11 when Penn State joined. By the way, that logo's sweet. The hidden 11 logo and the Big Ten wording, that was a sweet logo. But then it moves to the B1G logo, which we still have with Nebraska joining in, I think, like 2012, and then Rutgers and Maryland joined like 2014-ish. So we've kept that same thing, but we need some sort of alterations to the branding of the conference. Anyway, let's dive into this. I think we each have 5 tiers. And there is a lot of similarity because I think there's just a common thought about how this is correctly done and how it's not correctly done. But I do think that we should start with tier one because I think that's probably the best place to start, and we can work our way back. I had 3 teams in tier one. I think you had 3 teams as well in tier one. I'll let you kick it off with your 3 teams in that tier.
Yeah, so I mean, this is, I think, as a broad scope, like this isn't like a power rankings for next year, largely because UCLA and USC are not in the Big Ten next year, but like in 5 years or throughout the next 5 years, like which programs are going to be the consistent top of the Big Ten, like when who's going to have the most wins over the next 5 years and maybe make the most noise. So it's kind of like a future projection and an outlook on that. And yeah, I have UCLA as my number one team and heading tier one. I think when Mick Cronin took over there, I was not concerned with him as a game coach because of what he did at Cincinnati, even though it's not a great style of basketball. I was a little bit concerned as a recruiter. And like 3 years into his tenure, I've actually kind of flipped on that statement. Like he's recruiting really well. Like I was worried high major or big time players from California wouldn't want to go play for him. That's just not the case. They have 2 5-stars this year in Amari Bailey and Adam Bana. They had Peyton Watson last year. He's recruited the transfer portal pretty well. Johnny Juzang, Miles Johnson have been key players in the portal. So in terms of an ability to construct a roster, it's UCLA. It kind of recruits itself. California has become a basketball hotbed. Like, I just think there's always going to be talent in the area. He's had no problem getting it. I think he's could have, his coaching hasn't actually been great to me. Like but they've been good and they win games. And like, maybe I'm just expecting UCLA to be like a legitimate title contender every year because they can be. And like, for me, that's why they had tier one. Like their upside as a program is just higher than anyone else's in the Big Ten. And I think Cronin can get them a high enough floor where like once they join the Big Ten, they'll consistently be the team to beat.
Yeah, and I really like what you said there about it kind of recruiting itself. I think that that's a program that in general, like you don't need, like you should recruit nationally when you're UCLA, you're North Carolina, you're Kentucky, you're Duke, you're Kansas, right? Like you need to recruit nationally, but there's so much talent in the California area, the Arizona area, that UCLA doesn't really need to go super far east to find talent, right? And I think that's a huge advantage for them with how talented teams are out west. So I do have UCLA in my first year as well. And I like what you said about Cronin and maybe having a little bit more to prove in terms of like in-game actual coaching. But I think that program is really stable right now. Like he seems to be really happy out there. Obviously, there was maybe some rumors last year about him like leaving for Louisville, which I don't really think ever picked up too much steam, but that's just such a solid program. And I feel like its floor is higher than just so many other programs in the Big Ten. Like to me, their floor should be no worse than that of like what we've seen from Ohio State or what we've seen from, in Iowa or maybe even a Wisconsin in the past decade. I mean, Wisconsin was really good in the last decade. So maybe that's a little bit high for a floor, but I just think that they're a really strong program, and historically speaking, they're one of the best, so they should be in that first tier. I'll move on. I have Illinois and Michigan rounding out my top tier. I think what you have to understand with Michigan, and obviously this is probably going to upset a lot of our listener base having them so high, But Juwan Howard's such a good recruiter, and he's put together a really good talent base there. They have a really good young core coming in this year, highlighted by Jed Howard, Juwan's son. And then they also just have a really good history of now landing guys in the portal the last couple of years. And I think that's really important, especially as we kind of move forward into this next 5-10 years of college basketball, being able to be successful in the portal, but also being able to balance that on court. And that's one of the reasons why I have Illinois in my top tier as well. You look at the last 3 years, obviously Illinois has been the best program in the conference over the last 3 years, more wins than anyone. I think it's like 44 or 45 or something like that over the last 3 years. Illinois obviously is recruited at a top 10 national level with their 2022 class. They've been more successful than anybody in the transfer portal as well in the Big Ten. And I think that's really important because you're going to have guys leave the program. And how do you replenish that? And Brad Underwood, I know, has a good history of landing guys in the transfer portal that have been impactful and maybe even elevating them a little bit more than what they anticipated with guys like Alfonso Plummer. And I think you could even say Jacob Grandison exceeded expectations in his Illinois career as well.
Yeah, I mean, so those two teams also round out my first here. I have the order flipped, but I think it's well, I don't know if that was like your order.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I wouldn't say it's my order. I would probably put UCLA first, and then I think Illinois and Michigan are probably like a 2A, 2B kind of situation where they've been so close the last couple of years where it's hard for me to put one over the other.
Yeah, so I have them. I have Michigan 2, Illinois 3, but pretty close. It's for me with Michigan, it's just when Michigan is in on a kid, I think it strikes a little bit of fear in you when you're the opposing fan base. And like Illinois is starting to get there, I think, especially with like when it's a Tim Anderson guy, and it's like, oh, he's going after Ty Rodgers. Like Michigan State fans will be scared the next time Tim Anderson wants a guy that they want. But there's just some like level of fear when Juwan and Michigan are in on a guy. And last year was obviously a down year, but I think in hindsight, we didn't realize how hard it is to replace Franz Wagner, Mike Smith, Isaiah Livers, and Chauncey Brown. Just three super seniors, I think, and then one stud sophomore. They replaced them with a bunch of freshmen, and like that was probably a harder task than we realized. And they struggled a bit in the Big Ten, but they still made some noise in March. And they lost Frankie Collins, but I like their 2022 class a lot. Jed Howard, Taurus Reed, Doug McDaniel, all strike me as guys that are going to be there for a few years and be the core of what they're building, as this is probably Dickinson's last year. Maybe Kobe Buffkin breaks out. And yeah, I mean, I think Underwood and Howard have established themselves as the two best recruiters in the Big Ten as of right now. And probably two of the best transfer portal getters as well. And the portal is almost as big as recruiting now. Like you don't need to land 5 stars if you're getting big time transfers. So for me, just those two, their ability to get players, whether it's in the portal or in recruiting, will just help, set them up. Even when like, Illinois lost 5 stars from last year. There's no Io, there's no Kofi. They're still projected to be atop of the Big Ten for a reason. So that says a lot to Underwood's team building ability. And that's why those two round out my top tier, because I don't trust any of the other coaches to do what they do on that consistent level.
Yeah, and here's to me where it gets really interesting as we move into the second tier, because I think there's some movement for some of these programs to kind of move up into the first tier. So my second tier includes Indiana, USC, Purdue, and Michigan State. And I kind of want to start with Indiana, and you're obviously the Indiana expert here on the show, right? But like, it's hard for me to put Mike Woodson and the Hoosiers in the top tier because it's a program that has really kind of struggled really since Tom Crean was fired. And really for the last decade, they weren't like Indiana basketball or what we think of when we think of Indiana basketball. So he does have to get them back to that level. And I think in his first year, he kind of achieved his main goal of simply just getting Indiana to the NCAA tournament was like a big accomplishment. And then obviously you kind of throw in the win against Purdue. Obviously, that's a huge thing as well for them. And then you throw in the fact that they've got a top 10, top 15 ranked recruiting class highlighted with, 1 5-star in Hachifino, another really high 4, 5-star caliber player in Renault. And that's a really good starting base for him. And I think it's one of those things where Indiana's kind of flirted with a bubble a lot over the last 10 years, I would say, especially the last 5, 6 years, where Now you kind of need to elevate and be a consistent tournament team, kind of like what we saw Brad Underwood do in his time once he got to Illinois and rebuilt it. And I think what Woodson inherited at Indiana was so much better than what Brad Underwood inherited at Illinois, that he was able to start a little bit better, but now he needs to continue it. And year two is huge for them, as they might be the Big Ten favorite heading into the year. So I've got Indiana in there. And then Purdue is just a team that I think is uber consistent. I don't think Matt Painter's ever leaving that program for another job. I know there was the rumors about Mizzou, however many years ago that was, but I don't see Matt Painter leaving. And Michigan State's a program that a lot of people are probably like, wow, that's not in your top tier. Tom Izzo has something to prove to me with the way that Michigan State's trended the last 2-3 seasons. They've been disappointing the last couple of years. They flirted with a bubble a couple times, and he failed in the transfer portal objectively this past season. So that's concerning as well. But he is starting to land some high talent on the high school ranks with Xavier Booker and then Jeremy Fears, obviously in that 23 class. So that's showing like positive momentum over the last week that I think if we had this conversation 2 weeks ago, maybe we're not as confident about what the Spartans might be. And then USC is just a really, really, really consistent program under Andy Enfield out there in Los Angeles. And I think it's a school that doesn't get a lot of attention for its basketball success. One, because it's a football school. We think about USC, we think about Lincoln Riley now, we think about Caleb Williams, college football playoff, national championships, right? Like we think about all of those things. And we don't realize how good that their basketball program has been over the last decade or 5-6 years. So that's something that has USC in my second tier. And I think it'd be really fun to see UCLA and USC kind of battle it out for Los Angeles supremacy in a Big Ten conference.
Yeah, I think you summed that all up pretty well. As the resident Indiana fan on the podcast, I think this is a prove it year for them. You know, this is the year that Woodson's year one, he hit expectations. They ended the tournament drought. They beat Purdue. Check. He's shown he's a good talent. You know, he can grab talent as well. They have the number one recruiting class in the 2022 class in the Big Ten. He was able to retain Trace Jackson Davis and Race Thompson for a fifth year. You know, Tamar Bates is a guy who's a 5-star in 2021 who maybe takes a leap this year. So this is kind of the prove it year. Like they obviously have to make the tournament. They have to be up in the top of the Big Ten. And like Woodson, you know, now for me is Woodson, how good of a game coach is he? Can they find shooters? Things like that. And I think they have tier one, even though he's a little bit older, I think they have tier one potential.
I agree.
But I also think that if things don't go well this year, I'd slot them down to tier three and be like, they couldn't really do anything special this year. Like now Trace is gone. I don't know how much better they can get. So I think this is a big prove it year for them. And they're probably the most volatile team to me in these rankings. And yeah, so USC heads my second tier. And again, like you said, it's a football school. Nobody really pays attention to them as a basketball school, but Andy Enfield's been at USC 9 years. And after kind of 2 rebuilding years, like just 2 years prior to him taking over, they were 6-26. So it was a bigger rebuilding job than people realized. And they've won 20 games, I think 7 out of those 8 years, multiple tournaments. Obviously made the Elite Eight in the 2021 tournament. And it doesn't like UCLA, it does kind of recruit itself as a school because it's California. And Enfield is consistently getting 5-stars and future NBA players. But he also gets, good transfer portal players. Boogie Ellis from Memphis will be a key starter for them this year. Friend of the podcast, Drew Peterson from Rice is another transfer player. So I feel good about Enfield's ability to get transfers and get 5-stars, and he's a good game coach. Like, I think they will fit the mold of the Big Ten really well because they like to play big and they like to maybe slow things down a bit and they defend. So I think they'll do really well in this league. And then, yeah, like you said about Michigan State, I was out on them until the last 2 weeks when they got Xavier Booker and Gary Norman to surround Jeremy Fears. And I still Izzo's not inability to recruit the portal. It is a big deal. And I do think as a game coach, he hasn't been as good. Like
Great.
The talent hasn't been great the last few years. I mean, that's on him. But like still, I would expect some better results from Mr. March and the best coach ever, blah, blah, blah. So I have them in tier 2, but they're towards the bottom. I put Purdue at the top of my tier 3. And I think for me, it's the fact that they just don't recruit great. And they also aren't great in the portal. And that's why I'm a little scared. In terms of like developing 3-star and 4-star guys, Painter's maybe the best at that in the league. Like Jaden Ivey was a 4-star. Trevin Williams was a 5-star. Zach Edey was like damn near a no star, which I mean that was
he
probably
was like in the 300-400s or something crazy like that.
That Carson Edwards wasn't a big name recruit. Caleb Swanigan, may he rest in peace, was not like a big name recruit. So I know Painter will turn kind of meh recruits and guys you won't be too excited about into good players. And he's a great coach and they have a great home court. I just, they had Ivy and Trevian and Edey and couldn't really do anything with it. Like, I'm not sure what the ceiling is with them.
Yeah, I think my thing with Purdue is I just throw a lot of blind faith at them to be in the top like 5-6 group of the Big Ten as it currently stands. So I don't really know why I would change my opinion on that as it expands to 16 teams. And maybe Purdue isn't one of those teams that competes for a conference title every year, but I think they are a very consistent NCAA tournament team that could go to the Sweet 16 on a regular basis. So that is why I have Purdue in my second tier. And it's hard for me to not put them above like schools in my third tier. But things that you kind of said there about the way that they recruit makes me feel like they identify more with the third tier of teams that I have, which includes Wisconsin, Ohio State, Iowa, and Maryland. And if I were to like name this third tier group, I would probably name it one of these teams is going to compete for a Big Ten title every year, but I don't know which one. And I think that kind of shows how different they all are, right? Like Wisconsin, you kind of think slow it down, half court pace, not the highest touted recruits, but develops talent really well. They're a lot like Purdue in a way, but they play a little bit of a different style in terms of tempo and things like that, right? But they're uber consistent. They've probably been, I would say, the second best program in our lives in the Big Ten behind Michigan State. When you think about NCAA tournament success, when you think about conference success, I mean, I would have to go look more at the 2000 to 2010 era and compare that to what Michigan did in that time. But Wisconsin's right there with Michigan State in our lives in terms of the success they had. So I have them in my third tier. They've won a conference title 2 of the last 3 years, which is just kind of wild to say because I don't really feel like they've been that good the last 2-3 years. But Ohio State is a really interesting one because like I think Ohio State is kind of a lot like USC, where football school, you think of them more as a football school and the success they have on the gridiron compared to what they have on the basketball court. But when I think of Ohio State, I think of a better basketball program than I do USC. And maybe it's just that they're very similar schools in terms of the profiles that they have on the athletic fields. But I think I trust Chris Holtmann as much as I trust Andy Enfield. And maybe this kind of goes to continue to show like one of these teams is going to compete for a Big Ten title every single year. And I just don't know which one it is. And then I feel the same way about Iowa, right? Like, I know Illinois fans hate Fran McCaffrey and think he's not a very good coach. And like, there's a whole Fran fade thing that comes at the end of every season. But like, Iowa's been a really good program the last 3-4 years. And I have no reason to believe that they're going to fall off. They had a lottery pick this past year with Keegan Murray. I think that they have a potential lottery pick again with Chris Murray. They have other good pieces. Tony Perkins is a good piece that I really like. And I just think they're a really consistent program, and that's really important. And then I have Maryland here as well. If they can just find a way to land talent in their own backyard, they should be really good. So that's up to Kevin Willard to do that at a high level. And I don't know if the Terps can consistently do that, but their floor to me is so much higher than the other 5 schools that I have left after this in my tier 4 and tier 5. So that's why I had to put Maryland in tier 3, and I didn't want to make a tier just for Maryland.
Yeah, that's fair. I have Maryland tier 4, but I'm kind of starting to regret it as you talk me through it. Kevin Willard at Seton Hall has been really solid. Like they made the tournament 5 out of the last 6 years there was a tournament, and they would have made it. I mean, his best year got ruined, the Miles Powell year, by COVID. So, yeah, Willard's a coach that just kind of wins games. I think he'll do a better job than Turgeon. And even like this year, kind of starting from scratch, they've compiled an okay roster where it's like they're not going to be a tournament team, but they probably won't be awful. I
They
don't
could
know how
flirt with
long.
the bubble.
Yeah, I just don't know how long it's going to really take them to like get up there. That's kind of like I know that Iowa, Wisconsin, Ohio State, and Purdue, which is my tier 3, and it's the tier of like I know you're probably not going to suck. I know you're probably going to be in the top 8. Like, I just these schools aren't like recruiting like elite 5 stars or mixing it with elite transfer guys. Like
But
Ohio,
Ohio State just had a top 10 class. That's why I struggle to place Ohio State.
for me with Ohio State, it's like you had 3 years of EJ Liddell and you didn't really go anywhere with it. You had EJ Liddell and Malachi Branham on the same team,
And
and you
Dwayne
won.
Washington the year before.
Yeah, like like for some reason it's just not clicking with Holtman, and like but they're they've been up there in the Big Ten. Like yeah, theoretically, like Ohio State should have been better, and if things go their way the last few years, maybe they're a tier up, but maybe Chris Holtman just isn't like that great of a coach, which might upset some people because I feel like he has a lot of fans. And then yeah, I think what you said about Iowa is spot on. Like they're always going to be flawed because I feel like they just don't teach defense in practice. There's always going to be warts with them, but yeah, they're like those are the group of teams that are always pretty competitive. And then you feel like on a given year, one of them is near the top, whether it's Iowa in 2021, Wisconsin 2022, Ohio State's been flirting with there, Purdue flirts with there. Like those teams, one of them usually breaks through. One of them maybe has an off year and is like on the bubble, and the rest are pretty consistent tourney teams. So that's why they're we're not going to suck tier.
Yeah, I just think it's a tier that is a group of 3-4 teams that is consistently in the NCAA tournament. And I think this kind of goes to show the depth of what the Big Ten is going to be, right? So like I have 5 teams left in my tier 4 and tier 5. So we just rattled off 10 teams that we think are essentially going to make the NCAA tournament basically every single year. Like that's incredible depth. And I realize the conference is expanding and it's had years where it's gotten, 7 or 8. I forget how many it got. The year Iowa and Kofi were running it and were 1 seed the 2021 or 2020-21 season, was it 8 or 9? Like there's going to be years where Big Ten gets, 10, 11, maybe 12 teams in the NCAA tournament. And there's going to be a reason for that, right? But I think there's a consistent 9 to 10 that should be at the very least on the bubble every single year in the NCAA tournament. And I think we kind of named those. And now we can kind of get to tier 4, tier 5. And I have Rutgers and Minnesota in tier 4. And maybe this is throwing too much faith at what Ben Johnson's doing at Minnesota. But I just feel like Minnesota is a team that should hover around the bubble. I'm not saying you need to get in the NCAA tournament 8 out of every 10 years or 7 out of every 10 years. But if you're Minnesota, why can't you qualify for the NCAA tournament like 4 or 5, maybe 6 years every 10 years? I don't understand why that's not possible for Minnesota to achieve. And then I have Rutgers there too. And maybe this is throwing too much faith at what Steve Pikiell's accomplished the last couple of years, but they've made the NCAA tournament a couple of years in a row here. They have a brand, they have a culture, and that's really important. And it's hard for me to put them in a group below with 3 programs who I just think are bottom of the barrel, awful schools to be a basketball fan of, because I just don't think it's easy to be successful there. So I have Rutgers a step above Northwestern, Penn State, Nebraska. That's my 5th tier.
Yeah, so my tier 4 is Maryland. For those reasons I said earlier, and like Maryland again of these lower tier teams for me, like Maryland has tier 1,
Yes.
1.5. They have tier 1, 1.5 upside. I'm just not sure at what point they get there because I don't think it'll be in the next 5 years. Yeah, Rutgers to me is like the most interesting in the bottom feeders because Steve Peichel is clearly the best coach of this group.
Absolutely.
Better than a lot of coaches, just an X and O's guy and a game coach in tier 3 too. He's a good coach. It's just a really hard job to win at, and he's done it the past few years. But now gone is like the core of Ron Harper, Geo Baker. I think is Mulcahy back?
Yeah, okay, he's back. So is
Oh,
McConnell.
McConnell. Yeah, and Amarui.
Yes,
But like,
who I think isn't being talked about enough going into this year.
yeah, he's going to be a really good player. So like you have like a decent core, but like Baker and Harper were your core, and it's Rutgers is never going to be a one and done NBA factory. It's a tough place to kind of get elite transfers at. So he's really got to win on the margins here and get 3-star guys that will stay a few years and develop and buy into his system, get transfers that fit, his system, because he's not landing like Oscar Tshiebwe here. And I think it's possible. That's why I have him in tier 4, but like it's tough. I'm really curious to see how this year goes and then kind of the years following, because they have some momentum now. This is like the peak of Rutgers basketball. This is the peak of Rutgers basketball in our lifetime. And
Absolutely.
so, it's important to capitalize on it, because if they kind of lose this and go back to being Rutgers, like then they're at the bottom of tier 5 for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think my tier 5 is just the 3 worst jobs in the Big Ten and the 3 hardest programs to be successful at. And that's Northwestern, Penn State, Nebraska. Like, Northwestern's made one NCAA tournament in their entire tenure. Chris Collins should have been fired after this past year, but for some reason they kept him. Why? I don't know. For some reason, they think they're going to get better with another year of Boo Buie and Chase Adige in their backcourt without a future NBA player, and Pete Nance now playing in North Carolina. So somehow their administration thinks that they're going to be better without that. Penn State has just like never been good. Like, I think Micah Shrewsbury is a really good coach. I think he's good at connecting with kids. I think he could recruit, but then I think if he finds any success at Penn State, he's going to bolt and he's going to leave, because you can't win at Penn State long term. Like, that's just too tough of a place to win. And then Nebraska, I think, is just an awful job. We've seen Fred Hoiberg really struggle there in his entire tenure. And that's just a terrible place to have to be a basketball coach.
Yeah, I think that for the bottom tier teams, adding USC and UCLA is just makes things harder. Like there's just less like cheap win. There's just more losses on your schedule. Like I really think that in terms of the realignment, like this hurts the bottom tier. Even though your revenue money or whatever is more, this hurts the bottom tier teams. It's going to be like you said, we named 10 teams we think are like pretty consistent perennial tourney threats. Like how is the 11th team in the Big Ten going to crack in? You have to really elevate your program here. And I think like the top is going to start to eat the bottom. We'll always have Big Ten cannibalism where like a Tuesday night in Penn State and Michigan State came out flat and they lost to Penn State. Like we'll always have that, but like those programs aren't going to be able to do it enough over a 20-game schedule with UCLA and USC added. So, I think Northwestern, like you said, Collins is probably not going to be there long. I have no idea what Nebraska is doing with Fred Hoiberg or like where that's going.
They like restructured his contract so his buyout would be less. It's like the same mantra they followed with Scott Frost this past year on the football.
Is he the coach there in 5 years?
Probably. No, absolutely not.
Yeah, Shrewsbury.
The next coach they hire, the next coach there in 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Like, probably not. Shrewsbury, is he there in 5 years? If they're relatively good, probably not.
If they make the tournament 2 or 3 years in a row, he's leaving.
I think if they make the tournament once, he's leaving. I think if he can get Penn State to the tournament once, some other school will poach him.
Yeah.
What?
Like once. Yeah. Like yeah, I would agree with that. Someone would at least call, because he's showing that he can at least recruit a little bit.
Yeah, so yeah, it's gonna be rough for the bottom tier over the next few years.
And it's been rough for the bottom tier for a while.